guests, please let me know, and we'll work feverishly to share our microphones. I'm Rick Barton from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm the co-director with Karen von Hippel of our post-conflict reconstruction project, and it's good to have you all here on a windy Monday morning. Thanks for being blown in the door. We appreciate your coming, and we're especially appreciative of our guests. As you know, this is part of an ongoing series with CSIS's Commission on Smart Power. I think there is a list of some of our upcoming programs that I direct your attention to, and hope that you will also come for some of those sessions. They've all been really thoughtful and provocative. The idea for this commission was our president, John Hamre's. He felt that America needed to renew its standing in the world, and that a good way to do it in Washington was to pull together 20 distinguished Americans and ask them to put their best thoughts on how to do it. But he didn't just want to take the larger challenge. He wanted to direct it to finding the right balance between our hard power, which we have become well known for globally, and our soft power, which obviously we're also well known for, but perhaps was in less in lesser employ over recent times. And we have produced a report about a month ago, the Commission did, after several meetings and great discussion, which I hope many of you have seen. It's certainly available online and will be available in print shortly. Right now it's a pre-publication draft. It essentially has 5 major areas of recommendation, one of which we will really take up today, which is the whole area of public diplomacy and how the United States projects into other countries in its cultural exchanges, mostly. Part of this whole commission is really designed to fill some of the intellectual space that is available as we get into a presidential election year, where the campaigns are extremely active, but there's also a curiosity about what we're going to be offering with a new administration. And so we hope that the report will, in fact, feed into the campaigns and will feed into the next administration. And so these ongoing discussions are part of that process. One part of the work that we did was to have a dialogue with America. I had the chance to go around and meet with Americans in 4 early presidential states, and one of the New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, and Minnesota. And one of the issues that they brought forward over and over again was that we do not really know the world particularly well, but that the world doesn't know us very well either. And that theme has found its way into our report throughout, but most particularly in this recommendation section on public diplomacy. So we're really pleased today to have 3 distinguished Americans who have really spent their careers working in this area. They have all had a background in American practical politics. They've served with distinction in public life. They have led educational institutions, and they have had a global perspective. So their fuller biographies are available to you, but the combination of their experience is precisely what we wanted to bring to this meeting this morning, and we're pleased to have you with us as well. What we're going to do, the rules are rather straightforward. I've asked each of our guests to start off with a 5-minute discussion of their preferred issue in this area, but also to weave it, if they can, somewhat into our commission report. And at the end of that, I will start the conversation, and then we will move to you for what I hope will be an hour of discussion with the audience as well. So please prepare your questions and know that there will be microphones walking around. This will also be on our website as of tonight, both in video and audio, and the transcript should be available within a week. So you'll have a chance to let your friends know what they've missed and to encourage their reactions as well. So the order today will be Steve Trachtenberg, the former president of George Washington, a well-known community builder here in Washington, will start, and then Pat Swygert, the president of Howard University, will go next, also with a distinguished public career, and then Carol Bellamy, who was a former colleague at the United Nations where she ran UNICEF and was the first woman elected citywide in New York many years ago, will serve as our cleanup speaker, and then we'll move to the conversation. So, Steve, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying I want to associate myself with the report, and I anticipate that everybody here has read it or is at least aware of its recommendations. And yes, is my reaction to the report. Moving past that, I am basically a very simple man and believe in simple ideas. Not all of them original. So, for example, I believe that business is the business of America. I didn't make that up, as all of you know, but I think it's a useful thought to keep in mind. Having said that, I would quote my departed father, who used to say, "It is easier to sell to somebody in his own language. If you want to buy, you can buy in English." And so he made it his business to sell to people who spoke Yiddish, and it served him very well during his career. I think if we are going to pursue the notion of the United States as a merchant nation, whether we sell products or whether we sell services, it's imperative that our population speak the languages of our potential customers. And if you agree with me at that point, I would then point out that very few Americans are devoting themselves to studying the hard languages. Yes, we've got people who are approaching some competence in English, although that's debatable. But once you get past English, and youngsters who are going to the United Kingdom and Australia and New Zealand for their sabbaticals and their summers off and their junior year abroad, and once you get past people who are going to Mexico and the Dominican Republic and Costa Rica, we start running into problems. Now, more and more people are, in fact, looking at Chinese, looking at Japanese, looking at Russian, but we have fewer and fewer, or virtually none, mastering Pashtun and Arabic and Persian. And I notice that Iran keeps coming up in the news on a regular basis, and there seems to be very little understanding by most of my friends that it is not an Arab country, and that Arabic is not the language of Iran, and that simply being a Muslim is not sufficient, in as much as even the Muslims break down into different groups. And so if you look at the Arab and the Islamic world, you discover that there are contesting factors. And so the issue of language is the one I myself would center on. I think it's imperative that we restore something in the nature of the National Defense Education Act, and that we provide resources to make sure that Americans are studying the languages of the countries that are going to be consequential in the 21st century. And they are not always apparent. Some years ago, the son of the Prime Minister of Turkey was a student at GW, and he visited the president, and while he was here, he and his wife had my wife and me to tea. And in the course of the conversation, the subject of you'll be shocked to hear this, the subject of a benefaction from Turkey to George Washington University came up, and he immediately said, "Oh, well, all right. How about a chair in Turkish studies?" And I said, "Mr. Prime Minister, we don't need a single isolated chair in Turkish studies. What we need is for Americans to be going to Turkey and Turks to be coming to the United States." And we took his $2 million and we created an exchange fund with Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, and American GW students and professors go on a regular basis now to Istanbul, and Turks come to the GW, and what we have is a constant exchange of people who not only learn a little about whatever disciplines they happen to be in. Many of them are engineers, but also learn something about the respective countries and their people, and they develop friendships far more consequential, I think, than having a single professor who would be delivering lectures in isolation about the Ottoman Empire. Fact of the matter is, if you stop most Americans on the street and you say, tell me everything you know about Turkey, they say it goes great with cranberry sauce. They are not aware that this is a hinged country. They're not aware of its size. They're not aware of its complexity. They're not aware that it is half in Europe and half in Asia. They're not aware that it pokes up against Iran, that there are issues with the Kurds, and that it in fact, may be one of the most consequential countries in resolving some of the problems we have with Iraq and Iran. So I believe in the exchange of human beings. We all need to be, and I use this word in the most benign way, hostages to each other. We need to know each other's families. We need to know each other's children. We need to know each other's languages and cultures. And that doesn't happen by sitting at home in Ann Arbor, in Cambridge, in Washington. It happens by going to these countries, and going as students, and continuing to go later on in life. And so, I think that the genius of the National Defense Education Act, which I mentioned before, the genius of the Peace Corps, the genius of the Fulbright program, all need to be re-energized, reaffirmed, and in this manner make it possible for us to build bonds that will serve the world, but frankly, as a patriot, America, well in the years to come.
Thanks, Steve. Pat.
Let me join President Trachtenberg in thanking our host this morning. Also, let me also endorse the report, which again I hope everyone has had an opportunity to study. Let me try to follow President Trachtenberg's comments and his observations, and I'm going to cite to you a number of statistics, hopefully not too many, but I think one or two statistics really are telling. As we think about educating Americans, whether it be primary, secondary, or higher ed, one of the ways in which we're educated is our ability to cross-fertilize with folks from other countries, other cultures, other points of view. In higher education, that typically takes the form of exchanges, either exchange with faculty or exchange with students. The United States has been a leading receiving country, certainly since the conclusion of the Second World War. I have 3 pages of statistics, which I will not share with you. I will do that to you. But I just want to share one or two. But I do want to read the headline of my remarks. And the headline reads, International Education, a burgeoning field, but U.S. falling far behind in enrollment. International education, a growing field, but U.S. falling far behind in enrollment. Now, just one or two statistics. The number of students at higher education institutions outside their home countries is growing rapidly. I think we all know that. In 2004, there were 2.5 million such students worldwide, up from 1.8 million in 2001, and from 1.68 million in 1999, and these are UNESCO statistics. Estimates are that by 2025, there will be 7.2 million international students, 70% of whom will be Asian, compared with 43% in 2000. This increased demand is based on projected growth in household wealth, increased demand for higher education, the lack of capacity in some countries to meet this demand, and growing interest. Thank you. And growing interest in studying overseas. Now, one additional statistic. I assume that'll be my voice will be moderated by. Okay. I'll break out in song if not. One other statistic which I think is quite telling. In 2004, China was the largest sending country, with 343,000 plus students pursuing higher education studies outside of China, 343,000. As a group, students from China make up 14% of the total worldwide international student population, again, UNESCO. China is also emerging as a top host country as international student enrollment grew 213% from 1999 to 2005. We talk about, and we hear so much about outsourcing of American industry. We hear so much about Chinese products that are being imported into the United States and our trade relationships with China generally. There's also a relationship that's underway, which is terribly important, namely the higher education relationship. And as the statistics would indicate, the fastest growing nation in terms of receiving foreign students happens to be China as well. What are the implications over time? Is this something that, as a reflection of soft power, we need to put more hard thinking toward? I'll leave the question up to you, and hopefully we'll have a chance to revisit the statistic. Now, if anyone would like all 3 pages of my statistics, you can talk to me afterwards.
We'll put them on the record.
We'll put them on the record.
Yeah, terrific.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to, well, nice to join. I'm not sure what there is left to say, although I talked a little bit about exchanges. One comment on language, Steve. I'm increasingly convinced that this country, where we live, where we are, is a country that actually is a multilingual country that is on an incredible roadrunner race to become monolingual. And I don't quite understand why that is so, frankly.
Looks like it.
And we ought to celebrate the fact that we are more multilingual than we give ourselves credit for. Well, it's nice to be here. I see some of the, nice to be back with Rick, who I did serve in the United Nations with, a time that I began to feel even more how urgent it is that this subject that we're talking about is critically important, and that the United States somehow at least be seen again as a moral, not as the only moral authority, but at least wish to be seen as a moral authority, not wish to be a hammer in moral authority, but to actually demonstrate in how it acts as a moral authority again. And how was I know that? I got my start in life, and in fact, the most important thing I ever did in my life was soft power when I just thought I was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, totally unqualified liberal arts graduate who joined the Peace Corps back in the early 60s, but still the most important thing I ever did. And to the extent to which we're talking about those kind of human relationships, it seems to me that's what we need to be talking about these days. That as we talked about at breakfast this morning, that defining approaches to brand America in terms of marketing campaigns is by its own nature set to fail, it seems to me. But in terms of human exchanges, where the dialogue is actually real, where it's not false, where it's not something that's been conceived of, but it's actually there's an authenticity in that engagement, in that dialogue. I think that's very important. So in my present job, where I have an opportunity, I wanted to not just talk about us, but a range of different kinds of exchanges, because as folks, I even count myself a little bit in the academic environment today. We talk about students and student exchanges. That's certainly one kind of exchange, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But there are arts exchanges, there are middle-level professional exchanges, there's even military exchanges, there are Chamber of Commerce exchanges. As you mentioned, there's Fulbright, there's Eisenhower, international visitors. There's a whole range that seem to be, in my mind, too often seen as an add-on, same as student exchanges, until I think there's a full appreciation that you can't get a higher education, or you shouldn't be seen to have had a complete higher education until you've had at least one international experience, rather than, isn't that nice, in addition, something special on top of your educational experience. I don't think we're going to get there. I actually think business gets it better than the public sector about how important. I mean, one out of 6 jobs in this country is somehow related to international trade. And so in looking for future employees, having had some kind of international experience is something that's critically important. That being said, I think we have to step back just on student exchanges and realize that it's still less then 2% of all American undergraduates have some kind of a real international experience while they are in their undergraduate years. I'm not talking about the weekend to Canada, and I'm not even talking about the fact that they may have traveled, because our young people today probably have traveled. We see that in the students that come into our programs. But they are not disconnected ever. They remain in the American bubble, and they really don't have that kind of experience. So now that differs from institution to institution. I mean, some kind of small, high-end institutions will have a larger percentage than this, less than 2%. Community colleges, state schools, minorities, economically challenged students have more difficulty there. So moving more to try and create a platform where it isn't after-the-fact funding, where there really is a commitment to some kind of international experience, where not everybody goes to the countries they go to now. I mean, close to 50% of all international, close to 50% of all student undergraduate exchanges today are in only 4 countries. They're very nice countries: Spain, Italy, France, and the UK. But they ought to be going to Chile, to Argentina, to Senegal, to Vietnam, to China, to India, and everywhere else. I mean, there are many places. I mean, I always worry about risk in different places, but the biggest risks for our students recently have been bombs in Spain and the UK and riots in France. So it isn't something that I'm worrying about when we have a student in Tanzania at this point in time. So to me, the challenge is to, and maybe it's even the term, we use the term soft power. The challenge is to translate soft as something that is really taken seriously and thought of as very hard.
Let me pick up on exactly that point, because I think the three of you have agreed that this needs to be foundational. It shouldn't just be transactional. It should be part of our way of living. So how do we capture the American public's mind? You've all been successful in your communications to the public at different parts of your career, probably more or less so. But what do you think it's going to take to make this concept more broadly accepted, so it isn't just an add-on, as Carol suggested, but something that is really at the core fabric of how we're thinking as a society and how we're thinking as a government, because oftentimes the government can be the leader, can be the intellectual leader on these kinds of changes.
Well, I think the American people are the best ambassadors we can send, and I might add, not just at the student age, but across the board. I mean, it'd be nice if AARP would weigh in on this subject. But to be more specific.
And so how do you get AARP into it? How do you get them to turn on to this?
Pick up a phone.
Okay.
You call them up and you invite them over and you explain it to them. I'm sure if you gave them the vision, they'd be interested. They put out a magazine which shows up in my mailbox every month. It seems to me it's been coming since I was and they keep defining down what it means to be a member of the Association of Retired Persons. And they finally got to me. But I mean, I think it's a matter of putting things into their journals and developing travel groups as well as extended stay opportunities for people who are older. But older these days seems to me to be relatively young and fit.
I don't want to interrupt, but I mean, Peace Corps right now has an initiative specifically, even though they've been older volunteers since the beginning, they have an initiative specifically focused, it seems to me, on all these boomers at this point. To say, hey, you may have forgotten, thought it passed you by, but come on in. You can probably join.
President Carter's mother, remember?
Right.
She looked like a walnut at the time, but she went and she I think represented the country well. I've been chairing the Rhodes Scholarship Committee for a number of years. I've got to tell you, if you ever have a moment where you're down about the state of the republic, you meet these kids and they pick you up, and they are, I think, representative of their generation. They are obviously somewhat outstanding relative to other people because they not only have found the cure for cancer, but also are outstanding ballet artists. But nevertheless, there is a very large body of wonderful young people in this country, and they bring enthusiasm, patriotism, and a wonderful glowing American innocence to these conversations. that I think transcends government. It becomes a matter of generational communication. Very important.
Yeah, I think, firstly, I think we all agree that the late Mrs. Carter was just a delightful and beautiful lady. No one, but let me just say that I think one of our challenges is to convince the American public writ large of the nexus between the notion of a foreign-based cultural educational experience and their own livelihood and their own way of life. We've talked about language studies almost since the founding of what's now called American higher education. Many years ago, while serving as executive vice president at Temple University, I made a suggestion that was received with, well, I will say enthusiasm, but not necessarily positive enthusiasm on campus. My suggestion was that, and this was made by me in 1999, I remember the date quite well. My suggestion was that no student could graduate from Temple University, whose enrollment at that time was 34,000. No student could graduate from Temple University without demonstrated proficiency in some foreign language. Now, the Modern Languages Department of the university cheered me. I was carried about the campus on their collective shoulders. And I left the next year. I left Philadelphia. Not on a rail, but all sorts of questions were raised. And it's interesting, Carol mentioned business gets it. A number of the major businesses in Philadelphia, particularly the drug manufacturers, SmithKline, it's called SmithKline, Beckham at the time, Sterling Drugs and some others, they thought this was a terrific idea in terms of the new and emerging workforce that would be selling product, manufacturing product abroad. The rest of the academy, however, said that's fine, except you're taking away from our new chemistry building, you're taking away from our arts program, you'd be taking away from the new resources the School of Business is requiring. In other words, it was a resources issue. I don't think there was much of a concern that would be really a neat thing to do if everyone had some demonstrated proficiency, not simply passing courses, but being able to at least speak, some rudimentary ability to write, and to read headlines in a foreign language newspaper. We haven't gotten very far beyond that. I know of no university that has such a requirement today. There may be one or two, but I simply don't know. And why is that? Well, because the nexus is very, very difficult to make between that skill and life experience and success in life experience.
Well, I think that gets to really one of our big challenges here in Washington, which is we don't have a hard time coming up with great new ideas, but the trade-offs are not as readily sought. And so if we're going to do what Steve has suggested, which is to bring back the National Defense Act or whichever piece you referred to, or we're going to do what you just suggested on the campus, it is probably going to take some trade-offs. And how do you communicate that to the American public? Because that's probably where they're going to be most enthusiastic as a zero-sum game rather than just as additional responsibilities.
Well, members of the administration, I think particularly of the Spellings Commission, most recently Secretary Spellings, and people in Congress, whether it's Senator Grassley or Congressman McEwen, have got a variety of criticisms about American higher education. They focus on the management of universities, and they focus on tuition prices. Better, I think, they should be concerned with the quality of the services provided, because at no price is a bargain if the youngsters don't get the kinds of education that are going to make them useful in the 21st century. And it turns out that universities and the people who populate them, professors, administrators, students, are tropistic. Like plants lean towards the sun and their roots go to water, universities lean towards money. And money, it turns out, is the mother's milk of academic initiative and programming. And so to the extent that you want to influence the direction that universities go in, the kinds of programs that they commit themselves to, it's very useful to put a financial reward, incentive, program into place. So I come back to where I began, which is scholarship programs that make it possible for youngsters to go to universities, to cover their fees, and to study certain kinds of programs that we believe are in the national interest, are an affirmative, a positive way of incentivizing universities, rather than scolding them or rather than suggesting that the lashings will continue until morale improves.
Just a couple comments. I think we ought to be doing a couple of things. If we're just going to, at this point, talk about the academic campus. I think to the extent to which higher education in this country, even in this country at this point, is trying to internationalize its campus somewhat more, it needs to do that not only by virtue of having some non-American national students, but some of the not having them segregated either. But at the same time, if you're going to have an international speaker or a series of speakers, do one of the presentations in the community. Don't keep it all just within the walls of the so-called walls of the institution. Secondly, to the extent to which there are exchanges, I think it is critical that U.S. institutions try and make sure that, and whatever kind, because there are different kinds of student exchanges. There's the classroom to classroom. There's the multiple offerings more along what we do, but there are different kinds of good exchanges. But I think it is, again, important that the American student not only remain, and I used the term before, in that American bubble. So that if they're going to school here and then they're going to the University of Barcelona, that they're not just only living with other Americans and then going to class with other Americans in the University of Barcelona, as the case may be. I don't mean they can't be with other Americans, but at least it be there be more depth. Third, I see a couple of people in the room. I see Sherry Miller. I see Peter Simpson involved in visitor exchange programs to this country, and they don't just come to Washington. They go to Tallahassee and Minnesota and other parts. But how much they get beyond even there, more deeply into the community, I think it's worth taking a look. At least they're not just Washington and New York and San Francisco bound, but I think it's even worth taking a look of how it gets beyond the particular community in these places that's interested in international issues. And then finally, and this isn't necessarily academics, but we just, however it happens, somehow, communications. When I graduated from law school, I used to think that tax lawyers ran the world, but now I think that media runs the world. And the fact is you can't get a story on about international issues in this country unless you have the word terrorism in it. And until we begin to somehow have a broader range of media communication about the world, I don't think we're going to really begin to infect more broadly the general populace about the importance of two-way engagement.
Rick, I'd like to, and I know you're anxious to open the discussion up to the audience, but I'd like to, in Steve's words, I'd like to go back to where I began, and with the observation that as we're talking about enriching the American higher education experience, at the very same time, I think we also need to ask ourselves how important is it to us to continue to lead the world in receiving international students? Is that of strategic importance, and how is it important? Well, if you go to the campuses and you move to mathematics, computer sciences, engineering writ large, and business administration, you'll find it's very important because those graduate students, international graduate students, make up a significant community of teaching assistants, graduate fellows, postdoctoral fellows, otherwise. Very, very important. I think it's an issue that needs to be more fully understood and appreciated, particularly when you consider those nations that are rising in terms of receiving international students, as we are, if not declining, we're plateauing. I think there's some very important implications over time. Again, in my view, those students who come to our campuses, those international students, they're also part of the educational experience of our students who are going to go out and lead. Because one of the things that happens is that most campuses really do try to keep those students fully integrated in campus life, so they not dwell in a bubble. But if we're losing our leadership, and you heard just of one or two numbers, China, India, not surprisingly, countries that are also rising in terms of their ability to export product, they're also importing as well. And they're importing other brains, other talents from other places. And I think this is an important issue. Why we can't elevate this without the word terror or terrorism is perhaps for another panel, but it's certainly an important issue. Thank you.
Just pick up
Sure.
on Pat's point. And they're doing it at prices that are so much less than what we charge here that they are obviously going to be very seductive to third world and developing countries.
Without us having scholarships, we're not going to be able to compete. Let me turn to the audience, but ask a few questions of you first, if I could. How many people here speak a second language? So we have let's assume that we've either taken huge leaps as a country or we have an elite group.
Do we count on the panel?
How many of you have actually had one of these in-depth life experiences where you have lived in a country rather than just visited?
See, this is not typical
So
crap.
again, we're just so pleased with what's happening to America.
Right.
Well, we're all convinced. Let's go home.
So I think in a way we need to push. I'm happy to establish that because I think we have to push the argument. I'm sure that we've all agreed with most everything that we've heard. So please feel free to challenge us because I know that whether we're not going to make the progress that the Commission is looking for if it's just a matter of expanding the elite. It's going to be a question of really capturing the broader American public. So I hope as you ask your questions that you will first off give us your name, your association if you have one, and then keep your question under a minute or I'll get really restless. Why don't we start over here? If we can get the microphone. How many microphones do we have for the room? Okay. Why don't you head towards the second hand? You can pick it, and then I'll see where it is, okay? Yes, please, Monica.
My name is Monica Coley, and I'm a research assistant here at CSIS.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm a victim of doing the soft exchange program. I studied in Italy, but it was a great experience. But I've also spent time abroad doing community service. My parents aren't from this country. And I found that now, as someone who's young and is looking for what my opportunities are in the future, and when I was abroad, I think that you've touched on the problem that is this bubble. And I think one of the major impediments in exchange programs is simply that the communication of the opportunities that exist is not made available. There isn't that communication about opportunities that we can do as young people to the Fulbright. Those are the obvious ones, but ones that maybe aren't as competitive. Or when you're abroad, I think as educators, of making those opportunities of doing community service abroad are important. And I wonder, as leaders of your institution, how you can better communicate to people who might be interested but just don't know the opportunities are there. And that might help also to people who aren't elite if those opportunities are communicated better. So I wonder what you think we can do better.
Why don't we answer this one, and then what I'll do is take a group of 3 or 4 questions, and then you can each pick off the ones that you'd like best.
Well, I think you're right. It all starts at the top, and I think to the extent that university presidents like President Swygert articulate this vision on their campuses, and it permeates to students and faculty, and resources are available to make possible the implementation of the ideas, things will in fact transpire. But let's start it really at the top. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a president of the United States who made this a matter of foreign policy and who said, I think it would be a good thing if the world saw Americans, and Americans writ large, not necessarily Americans wearing a uniform, people who are plumbers, people who are, God save us, lawyers, people who are professors, dentists. If we encouraged Americans to go abroad, as Carol has suggested, to spend time in various programs. I mentioned the AARP before. Presumably some of their membership are healthy, retired, have time, could make contributions. There are programs already in place to follow up on these things. We need to be more robust about them, more encouraging. And I think conversations like this and the report that you have generated moves this ball down the court. But it's not something that's going to happen easily, and we have to stay on it and do it again and again and again.
Good. Let me. We have a microphone right here. And then,
Yes, I think this is on.
why don't you bring the second one down here? And we'll just go. We'll back up 5 here, so each of you can just pick, if you don't mind,
Right.
just taking notes of which ones you want to answer. Thanks.
Marilyn Sachs, Macmillan World Learning's Delphi International Program, native Washingtonian, and beneficiary in the 1950s, I'm really dating myself, of a foreign language in the elementary schools program, which I credit with really putting me on a path towards international programming, international exchange, interest in the rest of the world. Keep it really brief. How do we connect with, not only from the top up, the presidential level, but at the grassroots level, and make it bottom up so that we meet somewhere in the middle and expand the whole interest, ability, and skills in learning foreign languages and applying that to a larger world vision?
Great, thank you. Okay, let's take this gentleman on the aisle here.
This is
It's
on,
on.
Frank.
Yeah.
my name is Frank Dahl at George Washington University. Carol and I have had a lot to do with education in UNICEF for years. I was one of her chief educational advisors in the Middle East. The whole notion of education, and presumably this is at the core of what we're talking about here, doesn't begin at the top, but it begins at the bottom, and I'm glad you raised that. I live in Montgomery County, and I wander around and go into schools to take a look for myself what's going on. I have a 13-year-old as well. We're trying to find a program where he might be able to go and either learn Chinese or Arabic or both, and we can't find any such program near us. And I think this is something that many parents that I talk to seem to be worried about. Currently, I think in Montgomery County, we have 102 language groups represented, and we're probably only offering about 2 languages in the schools, for certain, that is, French and Spanish. Spanish, of course, is very important because the Spanish-speaking population is growing very quickly. I'm wondering whether this doesn't need to start at a much earlier age, at the primary level, at the secondary level, but it needs to start not only with good language teaching and more offerings, that is, more to choose from, but exchanges. I can remember my youngest daughter in Amman, when we were based in Amman with UNICEF, going around Arab countries on school exchanges as part of an international school that she was part of, and she learnt an enormous amount traveling to Turkey, Egypt, neighboring countries, and meeting other Arab and non-Arab children. That experience basically turned her into what she is at the moment, which is an ABC reporter, but she does the international thing in Florida. And if it hadn't have been for that, I think she probably wouldn't have moved in that direction. But the issue here is that education is a structural thing. We have to begin at the beginning and build the base and not just talk about the top. And the top is all right,
Okay.
but we have to go beyond that.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go back here? And then let's come up front here and we'll grab some.
John Rothenberg, U.S. Afghanistan Reconstruction Council, but more importantly for this, former Peace Corps recruiter and PIM at SIT. When I was a recruiter in the 80s, there was a real turnaround in recruitment of people who weren't altruistic. It was more towards their careers. This was very much to do with Laura Rupee, who was the Peace Corps director. Now it seems to me, from lots of things that I see, that there's a big negative spin on doing international education work or exchanges. I think that is one of the most dangerous things to this country that I see, and I'm wondering how people feel that can be dealt with.
Okay, let's take a couple more. Why don't we get this woman right here? Sure. Yes.
I'm Joyce Francis from American University in the Literacy for Globalists Project. A quick comment that to your data that I remember reading just recently by Fareed Zakaria, that in this decade, global travel and tourism is going up 44%, while to the United States it's declining 17%, largely because of visa problems. That people are so hassled trying to get visas here. So I think there's a role that we need to get on our government to change that. But on the issue of education, you all have talked largely about formal education, and I would argue that we can't wait for those folks to grow up and start voting. We need to be concerned with the adults in our country who have missed this part of their education and are voting, and that we should be targeting continuing and lifelong education.
Let's go, where's the, okay, please. Yes, you have the microphone. Please.
My name is Shelley Weinstein, and I would like to take this a level up of what the discussion has been and take advantage of the brain power that you have standing there, and first say that in my view, if the term smart power is merely another way of changing the word soft power, we've missed the ball game, because smart power is national security, and we have learned that in the last 6-7 years clearly. And if it is a part of national security, the point that I would like to ask about, while I totally agree.
You should feel comfortable it is. Our report says that.
Yeah. Oh, good. I'm happy to hear that. I'm waiting for the report.
Okay.
I have requested it. While there is a need to raise it, whether it is the grassroots or the top or the professional or the people in rural and agricultural who do not even think about education, there is a need to think about what the 9/11 Commission recommendation said when they talked about what they called then soft power, and that is to think globally. And without the recommendation of really doing for our global goods what we did for commerce, what Dr. Trachtenberg says we are a country of commerce, but we're also a country in the global society and economy that is information, training, and education. And we must think about, as we address this, there's all different kinds of needs about how we create a network of global goods dedicated to education, to healthcare, to training, and begin that. And I'd like to have comments from all three of the brain powers sitting up there as to what we can do that it becomes a part of foreign policy and national security, because as much as we like to give it good words talking about it, if you speak to the State Department or you speak to anyone experienced in government, and I certainly work with them all the time, you'll find that the state says, oh, we don't do education, and government says, well, we really are into hard power national security.
Okay, thank you. Let's give our panel a chance to take those questions, and then I'm going to ask you all if you could tighten up your questions and your comments a little more, because there are a lot of hands here, and I want to make sure we get the most everybody. So please, just jump in wherever you'd like.
I'd like to. I'm going to try to speak to two questions, and hopefully not do short shrift to either. One, the question first. One observation regarding our being able to reach younger people, which was asked by the speaker to my left, and the second question having to do with study, again, I think was consistent with that from our colleague from George Washington University. As it happens, the Department of Defense ran a very well-received and very successful, I would argue, program a few years ago, 2 years ago, in fact, at various campuses around the country, and it was designed to introduce middle school students to critical languages. I believe it was called the Critical Languages Program or Initiative, and it was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. As it happens, Howard was one of the participating institutions. It was a summer program I believe it was 6 to 8 weeks. Middle school students were brought in, and the languages were, not surprisingly, Chinese, Japanese, Arabic. There were a number of other languages as well. What's happened to that program, whether it was a model, whether it was a test program, I don't know. But it's one of, I've got to assume, other programs like it, and it's one that I'm quite familiar with. And high schools and middle schools were recruited, counselors were recruited, and again, as I understand it, was very successful. That's just a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket of the larger set of issues, of course, but I do think that raising and elevating those success stories is important. But I also want to just one further word in terms of where do we start, the bottom, the top, the middle, or do we start everywhere at the same time? What I would like to see, and going back to where we began, I'd like to see the larger issue elevated to the extent that it's talked about by national political personalities, because that's where energy is going to come, and energy is going to flow from, and ultimately resources. And how that might be done, again, one can discuss that. But until such time as we go beyond this audience, where 90% by show of hands, folk have already had, in a sense, the experience. I think elevating it, and this is part of the elevating it, and letting our national personalities know that it's a serious issue that serious-minded people think seriously about and are concerned about.
Quick, I want to come back on just one thing on reentry here. I actually think that one of the things that we haven't done very well in terms of exchange programs, certainly student exchange programs, whether it's high school or undergraduate, is we reasonably good about thinking about pre-departure and then the program perhaps, but the reentry and what happens when you have this young person who maybe has had their eyes open somehow and want to make some choices, and we kind of just, they come back and that's it. And so I do think all of us need to be thinking a little bit, all of us in any of the areas that we're involved in any kind of exchange ought to be thinking a little bit more about whether there's anything more concrete that one can be doing in terms of reentry. 2 languages. I spoke recently, don't know why, because I speak another language, I come from Brooklyn, but I spoke recently at the annual meeting of the teachers of foreign languages in New York State. And I guess my duh moment there was realizing these people were all very committed, but it wasn't so much that it was state education department policy. It was whether a particular school or a particular school district had some really motivated and committed people. So it's had some terrific things happening in some places and nothing happening in other places, but it wasn't because the state ed department has said, languages, and particularly starting early is very good. Secondly, in this country, what happens also to the extent to which we're doing languages is that in the freshman year, many of our freshmen are testing out of languages. And so they're actually coming into college sometimes with more language, other language, second language or third language facility than they end up in school. So to me, I recognize that English is the business is the language of business around the world today, but it seems to me a shame to really lose the potential of language. And my last thing is just to say, I'm not sure I agree that there's a negative spin on doing international work. I think young people today, particularly if they're thinking about careers, recognize that at some point in their career, they probably will, if not work in a non-U.S. location, at least be engaging much more in some kind of international work, not just only in business. And so I think that I don't think it's so negative at this point. Maybe there are just not enough experiences.
Lest we conclude on a melancholy note, I just want to underscore that there is a great deal more going on than we have identified today. I was struck just the other day watching some marches inspired by the American Bar Association to identify with attorneys in Pakistan and democracy and the rule of law, and to Shelley Weinstein's point, physicians and other professional groups in this country do things all over the world on a regular basis, and I have this vision as I'm speaking of it goes back many years to the ship Hope that used to go float around. Maybe it still does around the world. I haven't seen a photograph of it on the front page of the New York Times lately. But the fact of the matter is that this country is almost notoriously generous. The people of this country are notoriously generous in reaching out to persons of the world, particularly when there's a crisis, whether it's floods in Bangladesh or hurricanes or whatever the crisis may be. And so I think we ought to underscore the fact that Americans do care about their fellow human beings around the world, and it's a question, therefore, of nurturing and focusing and encouraging these kinds of basic instincts, which are part of our national tradition.
I think that maybe I can ask you a couple more questions of the audience. Perhaps the change that's being described is we've had this tradition, we've had this practice, but the suggestion of one of the questions is that it's really now more a matter of national security as well as of doing good for others. How do you feel about that? How many people feel that it is a matter of national security now as well? How many people here, so that's overwhelming, how many people here feel that your less elite friends and neighbors share your point of view?
That's a lot.
So you think it's still the view that's held by those who've had the kind of exposure that you've had. Is that a fair summary? Okay, so we still have a big communication challenge. All right, let's go to the next round of questions here. You just pick somebody in the back if you would. Yeah, we'll get to you. No, don't worry. The person in the front row never gets forgotten.
Hi, my name's Chris Capacci Carnell. I work for USAID in the...
I'm sorry. Wait 1 second to see if it... Keep talking, and then we'll hear
Talk
you.
louder.
Okay, in the Asia Near East Bureau.
What's your name?
Chris Capacci Carnell. First, I have a comment. I live in Baltimore, and there is a small liberal arts college there that has decided to make study abroad a requirement for all of their students, Goucher College. So, your story about making language a requirement for all students, maybe things are beginning to change, but I'd be curious to know, for larger universities, whether this could ever be a reality. But actually, my other question is that in the last Open Doors report, there was a point in there about more and more international students are coming to the U.S. to go to community colleges. It seems like it's a different group of people and maybe reaches out in a different way. Just curious about what you think about that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. There's a woman here in the front row who says she has a point right on the exact discussion.
I'm Margaret Sullivan with the United States Indonesia Aceh School Project, so I've been doing education in Aceh. But I'm also the middle generation of families that have been doing this kind of global outreach. And I have a story about my son, who is an Indonesian speaker and works at the University of Michigan. And he was the other day caught up in a visa issue and speaking in the middle of a party in Indonesian on the cell phone about embassies and visas and stuff like that. And the young men among whom he was standing looked at him in somewhat of a horror because he was speaking a language they did not recognize and they did not trust. And I think when we have educated people who are doing what they're doing in Prince William County about Spanish speakers, and are doing what was happening in Ann Arbor, Michigan, about looking askance at somebody that speaks a language that they don't recognize and don't trust, on maybe a subject they don't trust, that we have got a national division of what makes sensible international education, which is what we believe in, and people that think that multiculturalism is a nasty word.
Good. Good to get that on this. Yes, I think we've got a microphone.
Good morning. My name is Montrella Cowan. I am a senior at Catholic University of America. I'm also a fellow of the Institute for International Public Policy, which is one of the grants provided by the State Department to increase minority representation in international affairs. And I'm proudly an alumni of World Learning School of International Training in Morocco, spring 2007. Also, my daughter, 14 years old, is an alumni of the Ghana program at EIL. So I just want to say that I was overwhelmed by the number of people who have had these experiences. And I have taken it upon, I was so inspired, I've taken it upon myself to go to my former high school in D.C. and share my experience. So I challenge each of you to share your experiences. We can start there. At my former high school, Coolidge Senior High School, there's a population of about 500. They did not know about these opportunities. They were very thirsty. I did an evaluation. They were very hungry and thirsty for the information. And so if we share our experiences, then they can begin to make the connections, and their interests will grow in terms of learning another language or having an overseas experience. I challenge the panel because I have started a community service project called the Pilgrimage Project, where I'm trying to grant these young people, minority, underrepresented high school students, to have an overseas experience, to support community service projects such as these. And then in these numbers, as they grow, as the interests grow, then we can start speaking to the policymakers about what we actually want. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Why don't we, let's see if can you take that person in the middle? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Sadia. I'm currently working at Common Cause. I was here at CSIS about a half a year ago. One of the things I'm curious about is that, I think that it takes a while to actually develop a crisis in a country of, having a lot of people not like America. And I think it kind of makes the case for why it's important to nurture a very subtle understanding of America, not just only through taboos or through, as the report indicated, when we really need Pakistan or really need Afghanistan or people on board. What I'm trying to say is that what I've seen, from my anecdotal experience, is that people know America through war and taboos sometimes, and sometimes Americans know other countries through threats. And I think it takes a longer time to really nurture understanding. And how do you think your programs are already facilitating that?
Let's take a couple more. Do we have somebody over here? Yes.
Good morning. My name is Sally Gannat, and I am currently a student at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. It's a pretty large public school, and they recently added Arabic to the list of languages that you can take. I took a full year, and I'm hooked on it. But that's all the further I can go. They're not offering any more classes. And going to my counseling staff and my advisor, they don't know a lot about study abroad programs or immersion language programs. So my question is, how do you think that we can get the Midwest and some of the less populated areas into this trend? Because coming to DC, I've learned so much about programs that I can get into and that can help me that I wouldn't have known about if I'd stayed at home.
Well, you're in Washington. Go visit your senators and your congressmen. It's called lobbying, and it's it's part of the American tradition, and it is precisely people like you that these legislators will listen to a lot quicker and a lot more alertly than they will to people like myself, who are perceived of as having self-interest. I think you need to carry that message both to the federal government and to the state government in your home state. No, I think it's imperative that our community colleges, which are moving along here, which are a unique form of American higher education. Indeed, they are to higher education what jazz is to to music, be communicated also to the world. And I'm not at all surprised that people from all over the world would want to come to our community colleges. They are priced right, and they offer programs and degrees that are accessible and transparent, and which allow people to educate both their minds and their eyes and their hearts and their hands, and go out and make a living with immediate skills. Indeed, a lot of Americans are finding that that's true and either entering community colleges out of secondary school, and some people with bachelor's degrees from universities discovering that it's hard to find a job, go back and do a quote-unquote vocational or professional kind of program in a community college, which combined with their bachelor's degree allows them to find useful employment that they wouldn't otherwise be able to have.
Let's when we answer the other questions, if you want to jump in on these?
I just
So Steve took two of them out. That's good, thanks.
First of all, I was delighted. You were a study abroad in Morocco, you said, and your son or daughter was an experimenter? Where? In Ghana. Wow. In any case, I wanted to talk about Iowa for a second, or not just Iowa. I mean, it's not just, people aren't just doing study abroad from the coasts. I mean, they're doing from many places. But, again, there is some cost to these study abroad programs. And one of the challenges in state schools is because the tuition for in-state students is lower, then there is a financial challenge. So I suppose one place to lobby is to support the Senator Paul Simon bill to get more resources into, I always hate for that to be the first answer. Well, if you just put more money. But the fact is, there needs to be more money to support high school students and undergraduates, and I agree it shouldn't just stop with students, but at least there to study abroad, and particularly focused in those areas where you have the economic, you're not able to just take your full tuition, which is why you tend to have in some of your smaller liberal arts colleges a larger percentage of folks studying abroad because they just take their tuition with them. Secondly, I think the Goucher thing is very good. They made a commitment. They're not the only one. From University of Texas to other places, more colleges and universities are at least trying to improve the number of students who are studying overseas. My only concern about Goucher is it's a very short program, and I just worry. I don't think it always has to be a full semester, but just a couple weeks can be awfully short by the time you get there and you get back. So I'll stop at those. Oh, and I think working with local schools is a great idea. I mean, if we're thinking about alternatives that we can all occasionally do something about, even working with our local schools for all of us isn't a bad idea to just try and encourage that.
How many people, let me just ask quickly, Pat, if you don't mind, how many people here do some form of community service with a local school or something else that requires you to use your international experience that you brought here? So once again, we've got a little bit of a model group.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Good.
I would just want to say a word about what in Washington tends to be characterized as critical languages and critical languages in their study. One of the beauties of the American system of higher education is that over time it is responsive, and over time, though starts and fits you'll experience, you're going to find more so-called critical languages incorporated into college language programs. You're going to have studies of Arabic. You're going to have studies of Arabic and Arabic-based culture. You're going to have more courses and more language opportunities and languages that have to date been alien to the American experience of Romance languages. One of the ironies, however, of exchanges, at least in my experience, I've had the experience of teaching in Egypt, Italy, Israel, lots of places, Hungary. One of the ironies, of course, is that students will come to your class, native students, and of course they insist upon instruction in English. When I taught in Hungary, a student said to me, if I wanted you to speak broken Hungarian, I could sort of go around to the corner butcher shop or something, I'm here to learn English, and to the extent there's some constitutional law being taught as well, that's sort of an add-on. But I'm reminded in particular of Ghana, and one of the experiences, of course, in the English-speaking West African countries is that the language of university life and instruction happens to be English. Having taught in Ghana on 2 occasions, I experienced that, but it was the culture is what we're really talking about, not so much the language. But in terms of critical language studies generally, there's no. I happen to be you know, as higher education people, we are intuitively optimistic. The glass is always half full for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this profession. And I happen to think that over time, critical language studies, and we're going to have lots of discussions as to what's critical. But critical language studies is going to become more the norm than not, and it's happening. Maybe in starts and fits, but it will happen. There will be a response to it.
I think there was one question here that we didn't quite answer, and I'd like to just get your very quick response, if you could. What is the piece of America that you feel is least well understood overseas? What is something that we don't do that annoys you when you travel or as you work overseas that we have not communicated about ourselves?
Well, I think people are confused about the difference between the government and the people, and the extraordinarily sympathetic and open perspective of much of America. I've had the sad experience of traveling abroad during wars, during the Vietnam War. I was a student in England, and now, of course, when you travel abroad, and people who are critical of American initiative abroad find it hard to know where the country begins and the people, the Americans, end, or where the two overlap. I think if we had more Americans traveling abroad, meeting people from abroad, we could quickly overcome whatever unhappiness there may be about American foreign policy, and restore the good feeling that has existed historically towards the United States. I can't help but think that one measure that I always use is that distinguishes us from many other countries is how many people are trying to get into the United States and how many people are trying to get out of other countries. And to the extent that people want to come here, presumably they can't dislike us all that much.
Either of you want to answer?
If there's one thing that I've observed, it's confusion on the part of our foreign colleagues relative to what I would call American democracy with a capital A and a capital D, and all of the quarrelsome, difficult discussions and activities that generates. There's a sense that, you know, we're not quite as definite in our thinking and in our resolve and in our policy as we might be. We have this troublesome thing called a national election every 4 years. We have a Congress, that we have an independent Supreme Court. These are institutions that are largely unique to the United States, but they work, and they've worked well for us. I don't want to go back to that old bromide. Democracy is a pretty messy system, but it's the best thing going. But I think, particularly when we confront enemies real and imagined, there's on the one hand a sense of let's have American certitude, namely let's see the Seventh Fleet. On the other hand, there's a sense of that same expression of power. It is troublesome because of the arrogance that it propels, the refusal to learn our language, the refusal to acknowledge our culture, the refusal to acknowledge our history. When I taught, I gave 1 or 2 lectures at the University of Cairo, one of the individuals who introduced me had been a brigadier in the Egyptian army, and he said, you speak of American democracy, and you're speaking of a 300 or 400 year invention. We speak of Egyptian history, and we go millennia, but we don't get credit for that. You get all the credit, we get no credit, and that's true. And this is a Western educated, very sophisticated, multi-language speaking individual. But somewhere within that individual is a sense of you're not acknowledging us. And one of the ways you're not acknowledging us, you're not learning our languages. You're not acknowledging our languages and our culture. You have this messy thing called democracy. But as Steve just indicated, our decline in students international students coming notwithstanding, we have never had cause in this country to erect borders or checkpoints to prevent folk from leaving. That's not, folks still find there's value in this great American experience.
Carol, anything you want to add? Or?
I have a
although
flag.
we are building this horrible wall these days.
I have a flag, by the way, that I unfurl pretty much at this point as well.
No, I think I agree with both. It's the distinction between the human and the institution.
Yeah.
And I think because it's such a big country, we get to find in the institution, whatever that institution is, and then when they actually engage with Americans, well, you're different from what I thought. And I think it's because we get to find institutions.
This gentleman here, and then there's a man in a blue shirt who's also going to have a health problem if we don't call on him.
Not me. Tom Gittins. I used to be the CEO of Sister Cities International, and am here representing the new U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy, which is located in Des Moines, Iowa, not far from Ames. A couple informational points. I don't speak for AARP, but I do know they have an international office. I think 5 years ago they only had 3 people in it, and I think they must have a dozen or so now, so there is an increasing interest there. And certainly the Community College Network has a large increasing international consortium that operates with those schools who are interested internationally. I would challenge just a little bit the concept that I've heard some of, that there's a lot of ignorance around this country about getting involved. I mean, last year, or in the last 2 years, there have been over 80 summits on citizen diplomacy around this country. There are, at the community level, from what I've seen and traveling around a lot, there's a lot of current activity and a lot of increased desire to do something. It seems to me the issue is, that, as part of, I think, your report for CSIS, the Smart Power report, and this conversation, is that there are no goals and strategies for this country for sustainable global involvement of citizens. And that's the issue. And that's a top issue. I don't think it's so much a ground up as it is, you mentioned resources and other things that really have to be reinforced at the highest levels, whether it's in Congress, whether it's in the White House, whether it's getting back to USIA or whatever the issues may be. But I think I'd like to hear whether there's any agreement on that.
Great, thanks. Then this gentleman also in your neighborhood. Yeah, no, right here in the middle seat. Yeah.
Don't really need this. My name's Dan. I'm with the State Department. I have a small piece.
Go ahead, because we're going to broadcast what you're saying.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. In that case, my name is Fred. I'm with. These are my own personal views and nothing else. I have a very small part of the National Security Language Initiative, which is a U.S. government-funded program to get American secondary school students overseas to do language training.
And how big is it? What's the size of it?
It's tiny. We just got increased in our budget to about $8 million, which is a tiny drop in the bucket for the kinds of things that can be done here. Obviously, the needs here are quite great. We run about 130 students a year to study Chinese and Arabic overseas. Well, the reason I am offering my 2 cents worth is for Iowa. There are places you can go to before you go off to Congress and start lobbying. One of which is check the website, www.state.gov. We have a lot of tertiary level education exchange programs. Also, the Department of Education is a place to look. They're part of the National Security Language Initiative as well. And I wouldn't be a Foreign Service officer for 22 years without having an editorial comment or two to say. First of all,
brief. That's all.
Brief is good. First of all, I've served overseas many years, and I find this argument that there's this distinction between the people and the institutions to be a real falsehood. It's a real red herring. We are who we are. Our institutions help define us. And when you have people say, we love you, but we hate everything that you do, I'd have to ask that person, well, you don't like what Americans vote for. How can you really like Americans, and how can you, really like? Those are the things, after all, that reflect us. The last thing, too, is on the soft power. I served in Algeria, young Foreign Service officer, USIA, and there was a place right down the street from us. We could often hear the machine gun fire emanating from there on the Fridays. And it was a place called Place John F. Kennedy. And of course, that's the first thing I think of when I hear that America has lost its voice in terms of its branding, its power to reach out to people on moral issues and moral suasion. People believe in us, and they believe in what we stand for. We can't give that up, and we shouldn't give that up without a serious fight.
You want to jump right in on that?
Yeah, you know, language, including English, is very important. And I think, and I, not that I have a violent disagreement with the last speaker, but when we use words like hate, when we introduce hate into the discussion, I think we go into a whole different area. There are folk in this country who hate this country. And there are folk abroad who hate what they perceive to be this country. Notwithstanding that, some of us truly believe, our experiences notwithstanding, that we're bigger than the hate, that there is something unique about the American experience that in time, mindful security, hard power is critical to give you the time, will trump the hate. And I'm sure you don't disagree with that. But you know, there are, but I don't, personally, the analysis, I don't find the analysis personally helpful when I think in terms of hate, because that takes me to a different place. But let me just segue, if I may, and I'm going to, one of the very few prerogatives that I have as being a member of this panel, much like as a university president, we have two prerogatives. The first prerogative is we get a parking space, more often than not, sometimes. And the second prerogative is that we pretty much decide when we're going to leave the office. Sometimes, not entirely, but sometimes we do. But I'm going to exercise one prerogative with your indulgence. We a very distinguished group here today, and I'm just delighted to be here. But I do want to call attention to a former cabinet officer, a distinguished American, great citizen. William Coleman is with us today. Bill, you want to stand?
We'll come back to you and give you a chance for a question if you'd like. I think on the language piece, my suspicion is that there's more language training now taking place in the Department of Defense and in the CIA by far than in any other parts of the U.S. government. And so it's kind of, once again, the opportunity to strike a fresh direction, not to criticize the Department of Defense for doing it because it's wise to be doing it, but the effort that they have and the thousands of people that are studying Arabic now within the Department of Defense dwarfs really what the civilian side is doing, and once again may perpetuate the hard power model as opposed to the smart power approach. So
if I could just jump in, I'm sorry, one thing, because we were talking again earlier about, we keep talking about the government, but there are so many other actors out there. I mean, if one thinks about the implications for teaching of Chinese through the Freeman money that's been going out for the last several years, just an incredible power in terms of the explosion of Chinese teaching. And so it is, there are many more actors out there than it's not just government and non-governmental. There's a range of actors out there.
Let's take quick bites and then we'll go for one last round.
The complexity of today's agenda suggests the following.
Right.
Anything you say is true. There's too much, there's too little.
Thank you.
They love us, they hate us. It's all true. It's you know, people visit New York and they say, oh, I don't like America, as if New York is America, as if Paris is France. If you don't get to Iowa, you haven't been in America. The truth of the matter is that this agenda is so nuanced and so faceted that we could go on for hours and hours and hours and never get it exactly right, or touch on all the subjects. And there is government, and there is non-government, and there is voluntary, and there is AARP, and there are younger programs, and there are exchange programs, and there are missions abroad. There's church groups. We haven't even mentioned the religious and the faith-related groups. So, listen, as I said before, I don't want to suggest that there's reason for despair. That said, there is reason for us to redouble our efforts, to be concerned, to do more, and to read this report and to swear allegiance to it.
Thank you very much. I think we're actually much closer to 11 than I realized. Secretary Coleman, would you like the last word, or would you defer? there's a microphone right behind you if you don't mind.
I appreciate very much that you have this type of discussion. My problem with it is that when I read that in the 8th grade in the D.C. schools that kids can't do 4th grade work, I'm pretty sure that has to spill over into your university. I somewhat smiled when you talked about knowing this language. When I went to Penn, I really learned Latin because I thought lawyers had to know Latin, which isn't true. And I then learned French very much. But it turned out when I was called up to active duty with the 332nd Fighter Group, we fought the Germans and they didn't speak French. So therefore, and then we were transferred to get ready to go to Japan. And I don't think the Japanese speak French either. So I'm just saying. And thirdly, I just wonder, in my experience, like we have in China an office of about 70 lawyers in Shanghai, 20 in Beijing, and 20 in Hong Kong. And my experience is that the Americans that speak Americans, particularly if they're Chinese American, do effectively well. And I also find out that the bright Chinese speak language. You know, but the point I really wanted to make, that once you have CNN and it's all over the world, I've always had experience when I go abroad that people can speak English. And finally, I think we have a Secretary of State now who knows Russian probably better than anybody in this room. But I can't imagine when she goes to deal with the Russians that that's what she would do. In fact, when I had to deal with Brezhnev, and I went representing PepsiCo, and the deal was try to keep PepsiCo in, I spent an hour talking about Pushkin because my mother and father had told me Pushkin was black. Not only that, his great-grandfather, who was the first one that came over to Russia, was made a general, was sent to Europe for 5 years to learn how to use artillery, came back, and that's how the Russians won the Battle of Pultovo, which is the first time the Russians ever beat the Europeans. I'm just saying that I beg both the colleges to really think more about the culture of people and what they did rather than try to learn their language.
Great. I think,
well said.
Thank you very much. I think it's a wonderful conclusion to a rich session. Please join me in thanking our three panelists.